Welcome to the ITSPmagazine podcast network. You are about to listen to the Getting Technology Right, Ethics and Technology podcast with Dr. Kevin Macnish. Get ready for a conversation about global values and technology, diversity and inclusion, discrimination, transparency in data, privacy, and cybersecurity. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
So hello and welcome to Getting Tech Right, the podcast about ethics and technology. My name is Kevin Macnish, and with me today is Tom Sorell, Professor of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, to talk about ethics and social media. So Tom, could you tell people something about your research and your interests?
Yes. So as people will have gathered, I'm a philosopher. I've written things in quite a few areas of philosophy, but since 2008 or so, I've started to become interested in technology, and in particular the ethics of technology, starting with security technology, technology used against terrorism, surveillance technology primarily, and I've branched out from security technology and surveillance technology to cyberspace and online activity and different kinds of technology that can be used to regulate online activity and the ethics of such regulation. So that's a bit of background. Just some of the topics that I've worked on in the cyberspace area. I've worked on online aggression, crime and retaliation against aggression and crime, fraud, vigilantism, all that kind of thing.
Excellent. So thanks. So when you say you've been working in this area for about 15 years, I mean, that's not far off the age of social media itself. I think, Facebook started in about 2007, I seem to remember, or maybe it came to the UK in 2007. And it's felt, looking back over that time, that social media has never been terribly far from the news when it comes to ethics, whether it's about questions about privacy. I mean, I remember when your wall used to be public by default, and everything that you put on your wall, as it was then called, could then be searched on by people, through to questions about curating news and moderating pornographic content, politicization, and what was acceptable politically, what was not acceptable politically, and questions about research ethics from a few years back when they were engaged in some work around emotions. So a vast range. Is there anything in particular that you've been focusing on, or that really interests you in the area of social media?
Yeah, I've been interested in various kinds of online harm, I suppose. So I'm interested in stalking as it manifests itself on the internet, on grooming children for sex. That's another kind of online harm. I've been looking at some kinds of very aggressive vigilantism, as I was saying before, misinformation directed, for example, at a public health effort. So misinformation about vaccines in recent years, but before that, misinformation leading to manipulation of elections in democracies. All those things have been of interest to me, and I think I've written about all of them.
Excellent. That's quite a broad range. So is there something, as you go through those, there's always a slight Luddite in me that just says, but these are pre-existing ethical problems. Is there something peculiar to social media that changes the angle on these? Because obviously with misinformation, we can look at propaganda in the past, child grooming, hideously has been with us
Yes.
for a very long time, and so
Yes.
on. So most of these things feel like it is simply a matter of taking them from meat space into cyberspace, for want of using some dated terms.
Well, I do think that there are some things that are very characteristic of social media, and perhaps the most central is the perceived importance of image making. So it's true that in the offline space, people try to cultivate an image. That's true among many other activities. But I think in the social media space, the cultivation of image, the protection of image, as one says really annoyingly these days, the curation of image, all of these things are extremely central, it seems to me, to the kind of day-to-day life of social media. And there are many things about it that are objectionable from the point of view of a kind of um, strict morality. Um, I mean, there's the sheer narcissism of it a lot of the time, where because one's interested in cultivating an image of oneself, one's very preoccupied with oneself, but not in a self-critical way, but more in a kind of spin doctorish way, where you're cultivating your own image and trying to present an image that may hide, defects, and where the rules of the game are much more to do with successfully cultivating an image that attracts admiration and that repels criticism than one would find in normal life. So I do think that that aspect of it, it's not necessarily embedded in every transaction on social media, but it seems to me to be very characteristic of it.
Okay, so you think it goes significantly beyond the fact that we take care about our appearance, or we watch what we say when we're in public. We might not air all of our political or social views in public because we've got a certain amount of self-control over how we present. You think it goes significantly further than that then?
Yes, because for one thing, many people who are involved in social media are trying to assemble a group of, well, they're called friends in inverted commas sometimes, but certainly they're trying to cultivate a group of people they interact with who are not just friendly to them, but also perhaps admiring of them. Many people are interested in having as large a following as possible, which I don't think is typical of ordinary life. I think that there's a certain sense in which the ruling ideal of at least some social media is to construct a kind of celebrity for oneself, or at any rate, gaining a certain celebrity is a mark of success. And of course, it can be monetized because the more followers you have, and so on, the more advertising and so on you get, and the more, not only the more fame you get, but the more money you get. So all of that's very well known. I think that's something that starts to um, distinguish social media existence from ordinary existence. This idea that you have a huge following, or not a fan base, but something that could become a fan base,
Mm.
something that overlaps with a fan base, um, that sort of thing is a little worrying. And then I think there's also the sort of Snow White effect, where some people enter social media spaces and they don't exactly say, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all, but there is a sort of subtext uh, of that kind sometimes, or maybe a kind of cooperation between consumers and users of social media, according to which, if you admire me, I'll admire you. If you follow me, I'll follow you. And, uh,
Yeah,
you
so a
know,
certain sort of tit for tat exchange in terms of followership and so on. Yeah, okay.
yeah, it's much more transactional than things used to be, I believe.
Mm. And it sounds, and I was going to ask you whether you saw some of the main problems as being inherent to social media, or related to the companies and the way those act. But from what you're saying, it sounds actually as if the problem's with human nature. It's just that
No,
this is something
well,
which has tapped into a darker part of human nature.
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think it. I don't want to pin my colors to a claim about whether some of these features in here, in social media as a kind of a channel of communication. I'm sure that social media could have developed differently, but I'm simply saying that as it has developed, maybe after Facebook and so on, and maybe after some of the sites where you post from moment to moment what's going on in your life as if you were a celebrity, and as if what goes on from moment to moment in your life would be of interest to lots of other people. I think it has developed this way. I don't make the claim that it must have developed this way, but there it is. And then if we look beyond the sort of image making, you have perhaps its equal and opposite reaction, which is the deflation of image and maybe the destructive, a kind of iconoclasm where you try to demolish people's self-images where they seem to be inflated or pretentious, and sometimes when they're perfectly sincere and worthy, one wants to tear them down too. I think this image making and image unmaking dynamic is extremely familiar on the internet, and some kinds of online harm, arise from those two polarities, if you see what I mean.
Is there not, though, a certain sort of democratization going on around celebrity and, as you would say, iconoclasm too? It's admittedly, with iconoclasm, you've always got an element of the mob coming in, but I suppose it really, with celebrity, you also have an element of the mob. It's just whether the mob is for you or against you in a particular case.
Well, yes, I guess there's a kind of democratization if what you mean by that is that lots of people who might not have risen to prominence in class terms or in traditional, through traditional forms of education or, other gate kept bits of ladders to success. Some of those people can get to prominence in different and new ways, so that more people have access to fame and more people have access to approval than previously. Yes, I suppose that's true, and I suppose that's good at times, though some of the people who become prominent are maybe not so hugely attractive in every case. But one can also say, is it really very democratic? Because we're now talking about billions of people operating in this space, and a very, very tiny proportion of those is coming to prominence. Most of those are English speaking. Most of those are Western, and so it's probably less democratic than it looks, given that its reach is global.
That's fair enough. Although perhaps the fact that English is often just the lingua franca of the internet, for better or worse, might have an element there as well. But it kind of touches on that celebrity aspect, and what some celebrities choose to do with their time is that, social media, I mean, the internet in general, but particularly social media, has become very much a hub for social activism from some perspectives. But it also clearly opens up opportunities for trolling and taking people down, as you say, that sort of iconoclasm to people. Although it doesn't always have to be the so-called celebrities that are taken down. It's often normal people that are subject to trolling as well. Now, as you said at the beginning, you've written a bit about hacktivism, vigilantism, and so on. So do you have any, well, let's just start generally. Do you have any thoughts about that? What's your kind of perspective on that?
Well, let's start with the distinction between trolling and vigilantism. I take trolling to be very often a kind of gaming, where
Hmm.
the troll is approaching people on the internet and trying to get a rise out of them, and sometimes they do that in very cruel ways. And sometimes the idea is to break down the self-image of people who are themselves a little insecure and vulnerable. And I quite see that's a very dangerous kind of game to play. But what I mean is that trolling really demands a response from the person being trolled. If people are ignored, then trolling hasn't worked. If they get a rise out of the people who are being trolled, then it works. So it's a kind of game. The troll wins if he gets a rise out of the
Hmm.
person, or makes them angry, or makes them engage for a long period of time with them. Vigilantism is different. Vigilantism is a kind of response to either the breaking of certain received conventions that are received among an online audience, or um, the contravention of law in certain cases. So some vigilantism is directed against online groomers, pedophiles. Um, Other kinds of vigilantism is directed against people who break conventions that are respected in feminism, or that are respected in anti-racist milieu. There's a lot of conventions that are, if we like to say this, policed by people who have certain values, and who want to call out, as they say, criticize people who break those conventions. So I think vigilantism has, on the surface, sometimes a much more serious purpose. Sometimes it's trying to enforce, in a way, law that isn't being enforced in the offline world. Sometimes it's trying um, to make people who transgress real law feel that they're not invulnerable or unreachable behind, their masks online and so on. And, some vigilantism is directed against extremely nasty, cruel, law-breaking people. So I think of vigilantism as existing, some parts of vigilantism as existing in the same space as law itself. That is, being concerned to reduce harm to people. Um, and at the sort of more contentious end, it is just policing certain conventions that uh, groups prefer to see respected, but that are not illegal to break, like conventions over using pronouns, or conventions over um, whether, when one writes and tries to present cases, one has those cases concern women instead of men, that sort of thing. Um, those are conventions that could be policed, but that's not at the so to speak high harm reducing part of the internet, generally speaking.
Mm.
So there's vigilantism and trolling. Um, um, And one of the things about vigilantism and trolling I want to say is that they're often directed at individuals. Both of them are directed at individuals who are individual transgressors. But when we look at hacktivism and things of that kind, we're usually looking at a targeting of institutions, sometimes governments. So we have those kinds of distinctions that can be made. And um, uh, that gives you some idea of what the terrain looks like, at least from my point of view.
So it's sounding from what you're saying as if vigilantism, in the examples that you gave, all felt to me as very justifiable, very reasonable, reasonable actions to take, very law-abiding actions as well. So What about are you distinguishing between hacktivism and vigilantism then in terms of the legality or the justifiability of the approach?
Well, first of all, I don't want to. I don't support vigilantism in general at all. I'm simply saying that vigilantism might be more serious than trolling is. It may be targeted. It may be targeting the same things as law targets. But in general, my view is that law is to be preferred to vigilantism for the same reason as vigilantism is not such a great thing. And the trouble with vigilantism is that even if you get the right people and punish the right people, there's nothing to prevent people being punished disproportionately. And even worse, there's nothing to prevent in a normal vigilante and also vigilante setting punishing the completely innocent because of some misunderstanding. So in the case of online pedophile hunting groups, the wrong people who are not guilty of pedophilia, have sometimes been charged with pedophilia or claimed to be pedophiles and have been, very seriously harmed as a result. So I'm not a supporter of vigilantism or vigilantism, but I do think it's a different kind of enterprise from trolling. It's not frivolous. It's not mere game playing, though it can have some things in common with game playing. I simply say that where its targets are the same kind of harm as law tries to limit, some of the seriousness of law rubs off on vigilantism, just as some of the seriousness of law rubs off on vigilantism. The more familiar case of offline punishment of people who get away with murder.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things which you said, Tom, in your writings, and I know it chimes with other people as well, is that a significant difference is introduced when you're talking about online activist activities because of the element of anonymity. And clearly that's quite different from when we look at sort of civil rights movements in the past, or indeed anything in the past, where anonymity simply hasn't really been an option. Maybe you can look at printing of pamphlets in the 18th century, but even then they typically found out who was printing the pamphlets after not too long. And within the civil rights movement, you get people being sent to jail, whether it's Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, or Mandela in South Africa. Do you think that is a significant and important difference? I suppose is probably a good way of starting that, in terms of the fact that today the internet offers a level of anonymity which was not there for activists in the past.
Well, in the things that I've written about hacktivism, for example, I wrote a paper that dealt with the hacktivism of WikiLeaks and Anonymous. And I think the question I had was whether the anonymity of those organizations was always justified, since they often operate in human rights respecting jurisdictions. I completely understand why people are anonymous in human rights violating jurisdictions. But I think both of those organizations often operate in human rights respecting ones. So the question of whether they try to seek a kind of impunity by operating as they do arises. And one of the ways in which I tried to make this point was by, in the case of WikiLeaks, for example, was to contrast the behavior of the newspapers that WikiLeaks cooperates with and up to a point depends on, The Guardian and the New York Times, with WikiLeaks itself. At the time I wrote my paper, very little was known about the personnel in WikiLeaks, and very little was done to convince people who were consuming WikiLeaks sourced information about the ability of WikiLeaks to handle information. They usually handled information by dumping loads of it and relied on newspapers to make it digestible. So that there's this kind of parasitic relationship on newspapers that were subject to law and that didn't in the least think they were above the law. There's a contrast between that and some of the thinking behind WikiLeaks, because there are some people who say, and these are people quite close to WikiLeaks at times, that WikiLeaks doesn't have audiences in domestic jurisdictions exactly. They kind of, WikiLeaks serves a sort of global audience without distinction, national distinctions. And it sort of gives the impression that they rise above national distinctions and are answerable to the world, mm-hmm. which strikes me as extremely pretentious, apart from being obscure. So it's the kind of pretentiousness that goes along with some of this anonymity and the impunity that goes along with some of this anonymity that I was questioning. And I was questioning that because hacktivists sometimes align themselves with human rights promotion, and it's an extremely important part of human rights machinery that states parties to treaties, which are the main medium of human rights enforcement, that states parties to treaties undertake to all the other members of the treaty organization to enforce and be answerable to treaty bodies for the execution of human rights conventions. So the strength of domestic legislation is one of the tests of seriousness of human rights purpose. Mm-hmm. And I think in WikiLeaks you get this attempt to float above all of that, which I found objectionable. In something like the way that I find vigilantism, flying above law, sometimes objectionable.
Wouldn't a defender of WikiLeaks suggest that you're making an assumption when you say that they are operating in countries which respect human rights law, and that the very content which they were presenting, or the way in which certain states have responded to WikiLeaks and the Edward Snowden case as well, are actually demonstrative of the fact that these countries are not human rights respecting. And with that, and I'm thinking of, in your paper, you talk about the helicopter gunship attacking journalists. I'm thinking of Glenn Greenwald's partner being arrested while passing through London's Heathrow Airport. And at the time, obviously we're going back about 10 years or so for some of these cases, but at the time the argument was certainly being made that undermined the credibility of the UK or the US as being human rights respecting organizations.
Well, I guess I deny that. I mean, I guess my claim is that, of course, the jurisdictions that we live in, or the UK and the United States and so on, are by no means perfect jurisdictions, and lots of things are done in those jurisdictions that are unjust. No question. But that's a different thing from saying that that it's sort of typical and characteristic government policy, to unleash injustice for the sake of keeping themselves in power, and that they do this all the time. I think that would be an exaggeration. And in any case, a lot of that would have to be set alongside the fact that these treaties would, many of them, not exist if it were not for jurisdictions of the kind that we're talking about at the moment. So, of course, there's imperfect observance of human rights treaties everywhere, and perhaps it's kind of more embarrassing and more objectionable that countries with human rights protecting pretensions break them. And I guess that's part of the point of bringing up the Greenwald things and others, and and Edward Snowden's very selective scruples about when it's proper to act as a spy or not, when it's proper to be engaged in surveillance or not. He clearly wasn't a newcomer to this, but he suddenly had many huge scruples about it. So, I mean, I think there are many things to be said on all of these sides. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the more human rights violating a jurisdiction is, the more anonymous actions on the part of WikiLeaks and others make sense. The more there is no other way of doing it, the more that what WikiLeaks and Anonymous do makes sense. The more harm is produced by the events that these organizations are protesting about, the more what they do is justified. But if you look at the vast range of information that is dumped by WikiLeaks, lots of it is really of not huge importance and doesn't expose huge egregious violations of rights like some of that film of the Iraqi war atrocities did. So it's mixed, and I think that some of these organizations, I wouldn't say this about Anonymous, but WikiLeaks are very pretentious at times about how morally pure they are. And some of the behavior of Julian Assange, even when described by friends of his, is distasteful.
Mm.
So, all I'm saying, okay, there's a lot of distasteful people everywhere. Of course, great. But I'm simply saying it should not be taboo for organizations like WikiLeaks to criticize Julian Assange, just as it's not taboo for organizations like the BBC to criticize, people who do wrong in its organization. And if Julian Assange is guilty of sexual harassment at times, that should be called out. For example.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think that's clear. So there's a difference between sort of systematic ignoring of human rights as opposed to odd cases or individual cases and so on. I think we could go, well, as with so much of this, we can go down all sorts of angles for a while, but I think we're coming to the end of our time. So I just got one more question to ask, which is in what we've covered so far about harms and sort of your accusations of narcissism and then looking at the stuff around social media. Are there one of the key things I'm keen with this podcast is to keep coming back to the practical and say what can we do about this? How can we respond to this? Is there something we can do about either this narcissistic element, the democratization of celebrity and iconoclasm, or the issues around anonymous vigilantism / hacktivism / whatever?
Yes. I think there is. Yes, of course. Even though some of the efforts in this direction are imperfect, the idea that there are certain characteristic online harms and that some of those can be made illegal in different jurisdictions, I think that's already acknowledged as part of the answer, and is certainly taken by me to be part of the answer. The efforts of social media platforms to weed out some kinds of disinformation which is usually just exploiting the channels that social media platforms offer in an abusive way. Those kinds of things, which social media firms are already doing, need to be done better. So at the moment, a lot of this content monitoring is not done by very trained people. I don't think it's paid very well. I think some of it takes place in countries that don't have strong democratic traditions, and where there isn't always perfect understanding of the language in which some of the damage is being done. So there's a lot of improvement there that could be brought in by paying more for this kind of monitoring, and there could be more aggressive takedowns of some kinds of abuse. I think another thing, though, which can't be legislated for, is a sort of culture change in among social media users. And the only thing one can do is to point out that the sort of narcissism of some social media users, maybe it needs to be sent up rather than, sternly criticized. A lot of it is laughable, and a lot of people do make fun of stuff that they find on the internet. That's less urgent, it seems to me, than making sure that vulnerable people, especially children, whose self-images are easy to destroy, and they're easy to destroy mentally, that those people be protected. There are many agreed things that have been talked about in this area, like not tolerating suicide-promoting sites, not tolerating anorexia cheerleading sites, and all the other objectionable underbelly of the internet, and so on. These are the kinds of things that I think can partly be met by legislation, some of it regional, as in the case of the European Union. I think that the attitude toward all of these things in America is different, and the attitude toward regulating the internet on the part of the pioneers of the internet is very kind of hostile. They don't want regulation, but this is to do with the kind of second nature libertarianism of some people who are very influential in the social media world. I'm not a libertarian myself, and I don't think that where the cost of liberty or perfect liberty, complete lack of regulation is harm, I don't agree that there should be total liberty. So another thing that could be done is to question the extreme libertarianism of some people, especially in America, where these lines of thought are more popular than in Europe. But that's for debate, not for legislation.
Okay, sure. So it sounds as if, from what you're saying, that things are generally moving in the right direction, maybe just not receiving enough money, enough resourcing, or enough focus.
Yes, I mean, we could talk about other cases where there are examples of certain kinds of intolerance in academia, or certain kinds of intolerance of lots and lots of things on Twitter, where I think we could talk about other things that need to be done. One thing that occurs to me the more I think about these things is how expressing things in 144 characters is always a terrible way of doing anything serious, and it's terrible that we're there's so much addiction to sound bites and instead of arguments.
Okay, well, with that controversial statement, I'll leave that there.
Sound right.
Mr. Musk might be after you in due course, but
Okay.
he's got to reclaim his 44 billion somehow. Tom, thank you very much for your time. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you. Really interesting to talk about some of this, and hopefully we'll see you again in the future.
Thank you. Thanks. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Getting Technology Right, Ethics and Technology podcast with Dr. Kevin Macnish, part of the ITSP Magazine podcast network. If you learned something new and this conversation made you think, then add this show to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to the ITSP Magazine YouTube channel, and share the ITSP Magazine podcast network with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to our conversations and our audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.